IGCSE Revision Agriculture. So, some definitions. What is agriculture? Well, it's kind of farming. It's the production of crops and or livestock. Okay, so it's just farming basically, but it's a nicer word to say it. For instance, you can say a house or a residential place. It's more a geographical way of saying farming. Aquaculture is the farming of aquatic, so water-based plants and animals like fish or seaweed. Okay, there are different kinds of farming though. There's pastoral farming, which is the rearing of animals. So instead of like growing crops, you get animals. For instance, you can get lots of sheep and cows and lambs and stuff, either for like the fur or for the beef or for the milk, all those kind of different things. That's called pastoral farming. Livestock are animals that are domesticated and reared on a farm. So, basically, if you're a pastoral farmer, you have a livestock, because those are the animals. And arable farming, this is the growing of crops, so it's the opposite of pastoral farming. And what are crops? Crops are types of plants that are grown on a farm, like wheat, corn, rice, and barley. And then, in arable farming, there are a few different things. Well, no, it's not just arable farming, but just in general, there are even more categories. So, for instance, there's mixed farming. This is farming that rears animals and grows crops. So it's basically arable and pastoral put together. That's called mixed farming. Subsistence farming is farming that involves only rearing enough animals and or growing enough crops to support immediate friends and family. So it's also alternatively called hand to mouth. So you grow it and you eat it. You just make enough so that you can eat it. Then there's something called sedentary farming, which is farming that takes place in a permanent location. The farm and the farmer stay in the same place every year. So you have a farmhouse and you never leave. Then there's the opposite of that, which is called shifting cultivation or shifting farming. This is farming that moves from one location to another every couple of years. We'll talk about why they do this later, but basically sedentary is when they stay in the same place. The farm shifting is when they move every couple of years. Then lastly, commercial farming is farming for the purpose of making a profit. So it's commercial, so you want to sell it. So you try and make lots. Some random definitions. Hectare, just so you kind of get the idea of how large farms are. A hectare is an area of measurement equivalent to 10,000 meters squared. It's quite a large place. Okay. Yield, this is the amount of crops that are harvested, i.e. the crop output. So, yeah, that's how much you get. Your yield is like the shit you received from your crop. Okay, there are then, within all these categories, there are different types, like ways to farm. One is extensive, which is obviously the opposite of intensive. Let's start with extensive. So this is where there are relatively few inputs per hectare of land. Like, you will not put a lot of stuff into it. This is normally a larger farm. Like, it's got a large area. It generally has very few inputs per hectare, so you're not putting in a lot of money. And relatively few workers per hectare. You're not putting in machines, workers, or anything like that. I mean, you are, but just a very few. And you get relatively low yields per hectare. So since you're not putting like fertilizer, machines, and all that great stuff, you're just getting a low yield. And then there's the opposite. It's called intensive farming. This is where there are relatively high inputs and outputs per hectare of land. This is normally a smaller farm, but there are huge inputs per hectare, so huge amounts of money and soil, good soil, and all that jazz. And there are also a relatively high number of workers per hectare. So this translates into a high yield per hectare. So it's just intensive, lots of people in a small area working really hard with lots of money. And extensive is a large area with few people with few money, so there'll be few yield. It's quite a simple concept. Farming as a system. Just like industry, Farming can also be looked at as a system with inputs, processes, and outputs. In farming, physical, so natural, and human impacts are normally separated. Okay, what are some human inputs? Things that are built or made by humans and added to a farm. So labor, so the workers, machinery, tractors, combined harvesters, etc. Buildings like barns, seeds to grow, we make them, um, or we add them there. Animal food, fertilizers and pesticides, calves, chicks, piglets, etc. These are just the small animals that you bring there and to sell later when they're older. So we'll put them under human inputs. But it won't make you separate them into human and physical, but I thought I'd just show you. So the physical inputs. These are the natural things that are either found on a farm or are added to a farm. Okay, soil. If soil is fertile, then we're still in inputs. If soil is fertile, then arable farming is likely to take place. If it is less fertile and can only support grass, then pastoral farming, so where you only rear animals, is likely to take place. Precipitation is the water that helps water the crops. So for instance, rain is precipitation. Sun, you'd also want sun as an input because it has energy to help plants and animals to grow. Because, the sun, photosynthesis, keeps the plants alive, the animals eat the plants, blah, blah, blah. It's a cycle of life, y'all. Okay, alluvium. This is mineral and nutrient-rich sediment that is transported by rivers and deposited on floodplains in times of flood. And this is always a good thing for, the soil and all that rubbish. So, but you don't need to explain them. Just remember alluvium, precipitation, sun, soil. Also, flood water. Floods not only bring alluvium, but also water to keep the ground moist. Because say you've got a river next to your crops, and then it floods, well, yeah, it's kind of an irrigation system. It puts water all over the place. Okay. Relief. This is how flat the land is or not. If land is flat, then it is easier for arable farming to take place. If land is hilly, then pastoral farming is more likely to take place. Drainage. It is important that fields are well drained so they are not permanently flooded. Apart from rice, most crops and animals can't survive being permanently submerged. So then, we got past the input part and now we have the processes. Processes are the events that take place on a farm to turn inputs into outputs. So, firstly, rearing. This is the caring for and supporting of animals to maturity. So for instance, you get a baby cow and then you grow it, you're super nice to it, you may occasionally take milk and stuff, but you won't kill it. But then when it's really old, you kill it to get beef. But for the instance, you're just rearing it. Shearing it is when you remove wool from animals, normally sheep. So just think of the word tear, like you're tearing their fur apart. Well, no, you're shearing it. You can say it's sharing it, kind of. Just a way to remember it. Plowing is when you turn over the land to prepare it for planting seeds. So you would have not an axe, but some kind of instrument, and you would just poke it underneath the earth and put up a bit of soil so that you kind of prep it for planting seeds. Then fertilizing. This is when you add chemicals to the soil to try and make it more fertile. Yeah. And weeding is when you remove alien plants. So plants other than the crops that you are growing. So for instance, I don't even know how to say it in English. Never mind. Just plants that they don't want. So from crop fields, that's called weeding because you're taking away weeds that you don't want. Then irrigating, this is when you water the land. Cultivating is to care for and grow crops. Harvesting is the collection of crops at the end of the growing season. So say you've grown tomatoes, then when you pluck the tomatoes, so when you take them off the plants, this is called harvesting. But not just with one, you do it with a whole field of stuff. Then slaughtering. This is the killing of animals once they have reached maturity and are ready to sell. Because then you give it to the butchers, their meat. Planting is when you put the seeds into the ground, obviously. Then you've also got outputs, things that are produced on a farm and are often sold. Firstly, profits, because when you sell the stuff, you make money. Then meat products, like lamb, beef, chicken, pork. Then you'd also have wool, normally from sheep, milk, normally from the cows, waste, like animal excrement, methane, mainly from cows, crops, because you do get the crops, so corn, wheat, carrots, potatoes. We are saying that this is mixed farming, by the way. If a farmer has a really successful year, I'm sorry, I keep yawning. He may be able to change his inputs the next year by, firstly, buying more land, because if he had a small, if he had a really successful year, so he made lots of money, well, he can make more money the next year by buying more land, because then he'll have even a higher yield. He can also buy better and newer equipment, like a tractor or a combined harvester, because long term it will help him. Then he can also improve the drainage and or irrigation. He can buy new varieties of seeds, maybe genetically modified crops. We'll talk about those later. He could build new buildings like barns or greenhouses, and he could buy more animals or simply just better breeds. Okay. Alternatively, the farmer may choose to have a more relaxing year and leave some of the land fallow, which means rest, or set it aside for environmental purposes. However, if a farmer has had a really bad year, he has to make decisions the next year. Does he invest in inputs and try and recoup losses, or does he cut back on inputs? His choices may include to sell some of his livestock, so some of his animals, or he may sell some of his land. He may diversify by opening a shop or a small B&B. So he could start selling, for instance, like little things like milk or honey or natural stuff like that. He may try and farm more intensively by buying more fertilizers and pesticides on a smaller land. So he could also sell the land and start farming intensively. Okay, some more. I'm sorry, I really need to wake up. Okay, definitions: barns. This is a large structure normally made from wood or steel to store machinery, harvested crops, or to protect animals. Just think a barn in a farm. It's not really a crazy word. Humans can change some of the natural inputs found on farms. The changes are not always intentional, nor always caused by the farmer, but include climate change. It is now widely accepted that the main cause of climate change is the enhanced greenhouse effect that has been caused by humans. The climate is changing in many ways and altering natural inputs in many ways. Some areas are getting warmer and drier because of climate change, and while others are getting wetter. Whatever the change, farmers will have to adapt to the changing inputs. Also, acid rain. Acid rain, which is largely caused by human pollution, can alter the pH of soil and damage crops again, forcing farmers to adapt their farming techniques. Construction of a dam. A construction of a nearby dam may improve the supply of water and allow new irrigation channels to be built. But it will also reduce flooding and therefore the amount of alluvium that is deposited on a farmland. The reduced input of alluvium may force farmers to use more fertilizers. Irrigation channels. The construction of irrigation channels diverting more water onto farmland should make the ground more moist and easier to farm. It's kind of you make a little river channel that you connect to the river or something, or even just you can put in your own water from I don't know, for buckets or something, but you make channels that flow all across the crops, and then when they just irrigate the whole crop. Then you've got drainage ditches. Improved drainage may allow previously flooded land to be farmed and drain flood water away quicker. Okay, so the Green Revolution. What was that? This was the introduction of modern Western-style farming techniques in the less economically developed countries during the late 1960s and 1970s. What it was this guy went around in lots of poorer countries and taught people really effective ways to farm. He suggested the HYV, which means high yield variety crops, and they were developed to try and end food shortages by increasing the yields. High-yield varieties were first developed by cross-pollinating different varieties of rice. Increasingly, this is being done through genetic modification. So, he did say it should be labor-intensive, so when work is done mainly by humans and animals. Tenure, it's just a definition, this means who owns the land. In many societies, on someone's death, the land is passed on to the eldest son or divided amongst all the siblings. If the land is divided, it means the plots of land get smaller and smaller with each generation and become increasingly difficult to farm effectively. Okay, so this green revolution, where this guy tried to improve farming all over the world, was it successful? To some extent. Firstly, the HIV crops did increase food production and made countries like India more self-sufficient. Food prices began to fall, making them more affordable for the poor because there was more food, so more crops could be grown because of the shorter growing seasons. And the yields were more reliable because and different crops were grown, adding variety to local diet. There were also surpluses, so crops could then be traded commercially, and many farmers became a lot wealthier. But there were also some failures. Firstly, large amounts of fertilizers and pesticides were needed that could then pollute water sources. Also, the HIV were more susceptible to disease and drought, so they could die very easily. More water also had to be diverted to growing the crops, so you're using more water. And many poorer farmers could not afford to buy the more expensive high-yield variety seed because it's pretty technologically advanced seed for that time. It was fairly expensive, so many of the farmers couldn't even afford it. Also, mechanization took place and led to unemployment, so they stopped having farmers. No, they just used machines. And many natural varieties were lost, so normal seeds that were not genetically modified at all. Also, countries and farmers became dependent of foreign companies for the supply of the seed, and that's never good. Okay. Now moving on, there are a number of ways that subsistence farmers, so hand-to-mouth farmers, can try and increase their yields and make money. If they increase their yields, they can support their families, but also possibly have more to sell and earn an income. So, firstly, they can use a high-yield variety or genetically modified crops. These could increase the average yield, but they are expensive to buy. Also, intensive farming may degrade the quality of the soil over time. This is a problem, especially if you're a sedentary farmer. You can't just leave when your soil is not good anymore. So, you could buy more land if you wanted to increase your yield. It's not always possible, but if a farmer has money, even if it's a loan, he could try to buy extra land. He could also do a land reform, which is when he changes traditional practices of dividing land into smaller and smaller profits, which can ensure that plots of land remain big enough to make farming sustainable. Also, you can use fertilizers and pesticides. Using fertilizers so it's possible to grow more intensively and to use pesticides to stop plants being killed by infestations will obviously increase your yield because your plants aren't dying and they're growing more intensively. So, 2 crops. In some countries, it is possible to grow 2 sets of crops each year. These might be the same crops or different crops. Even if climatic conditions are favorable by changing some of the inputs like irrigation and drainage, then it may be possible. Modern machinery. Using machinery might not always be possible in small plots of land, but it may be possible if neighboring farmers are cooperating. Machinery should make farming more efficient and may increase yields by plowing better and harvesting quicker. Remember, plowing is when you make the land ready to put in the seeds, and harvesting is when you take away the finished product from the grown plant. Irrigation. By watering crops more frequently, it may be possible to grow crops over a longer season, grow for 2 seasons, or farm land that was previously too arid, which means dry. Cooperatives. By joining together so you're cooperating with nearby farmers, farmers can share technology and possibly even land to try and increase production. Lastly, they can try terracing. By terracing on hillsides, farmers may be able to increase the size of their land. Terracing can also reduce the use of water. Terracing is basically, I'll find you a picture. So, I just googled a picture and pasted it. Okay, so this is terracing. It's basically, you make little terraces out of your land, like that. You always kind of dig in here, and this is kind of a close-up. Alright? Great. So, mechanization. Replacing humans with machines. Commercial farms will use more equipment like tractors and combine harvesters. Diversification. This means to increase the range of your products. You diversify them. In farming, this might be moving to mixed farming or adding new crops. However, it might also mean opening a bed and breakfast, a small guest house, opening a coffee shop or farm shop, or even allowing educational visits. Subsidies. These are financial help given to industries to make their production cheaper. The European Union gives many of its farmers subsidies in order to protect tradition, to be self-sufficient, and to protect from foreign competition. NIMBY stands for Not in My Backyard, and it is the phenomenon of people approving of certain developments, but not wanting them to happen near where they live. For instance, a wind turbine. We all know that, it's good, it's sustainable, free energy, not harmful to the environment, but who wants to have a wind turbine next to their house? Not in my backyard. Then, CAP is the Common Agricultural Policy. This is the European Union's farming policy aimed at creating a single European market for farm products, become self-sufficient, increase farm income, and provide financial support. You don't need to know this though. I just kind of put it in there anyway. Surpluses, this is when you have an excess of crops. You have plus too much, you have a surplus. A surplus for a subsistence farmer will mean that they can sell it at market and make a profit because they have more than they need. A surplus for a commercial farmer may mean that they have too much to sell and may dump it as aid on an LEDC or simply throw it away. Countries or individual farms may produce surpluses for a number of reasons, including subsidies. Financial help may allow a farmer to increase his inputs, such as land, machinery, irrigation, etc., which will allow them to make more crops. Favorable natural inputs. Farms or countries may have ideal conditions to grow certain crops. The relief of the land, the fertility of the land, and weather may all be perfect. Some years may also be better than others because of hot summers or absence of frost, which makes certain years better than others, creating surpluses. So these are all things that result in surpluses. So main sector of the economy. For countries where farming is the main sector of the economy, then greater support and help will be put into the farming sector, giving it a better chance to produce surpluses for sale. Crop varieties. The use of new varieties like genetically modified crops may increase, or just GM crops may increase yields and lead to surpluses. Farming techniques/practices. New farming techniques like greater use of fertilizers, irrigation, or crop rotation may increase yields. Okay, just some more definitions. Cash crops. Cash crops are crops that are normally grown in large plantations for the purpose of selling to make a profit. Cash crops are often grown in LEDCs and refer to things like bananas, tea, rubber, coffee beans, cocoa beans, and palm oil. But they can also refer to corn, wheat, barley, etc., which would more likely be grown in more economically developed countries. Cash crops are sometimes referred to as commodities. Monoculture, mono is one. This is the growing of only one type of crop. There are a number of problems that come from specializing in one crop, so with monoculture. So if you only grow one kind of crop, there are problems. For instance, firstly, disease. If you only grow one crop, they can be wiped out completely if they're attacked by a disease or a parasite. If you have a mixture of crops, then some may survive because they'll all have different immune systems. But if it's the same kind of crop, they will all die. Price fluctuations. Because cash crops are traded globally, their prices can fluctuate with changes in supply and demand. Therefore, if you are only growing one crop and the price collapses, then you lose the majority of your income, so it's very risky. think of it as making an investment. You have, say you have 100 euros, you want to invest in this club, that club, this club, which is good, because then if one club fails, you still have the other two that can succeed. But if you only invest everything you have in just one club, then, and it closes or something, then you've lost everything. So it's not a good thing. Changing demand. Again, if you only grow one crop and the demand for that crop changes, then you potentially lose all of your income. For example, if you grow only coffee and every person suddenly stops drinking coffee because of the fear of caffeine, then you could lose all of your income. And also natural disasters. Some crops are more vulnerable to natural disasters than others. For example, frost can destroy fruits, grains can be flooded by rain, bananas can be damaged by hurricanes. Therefore, it is better to grow a variety of crops as to minimize the risk of damage. So, like we spoke about before, shifting cultivation, which is the opposite of the sedentary farming. Sorry. So this is farming that This is farming that involves clearing an area of land, so deforestation, in order to farm. Shifting cultivation is usually small scale, so not large, subsistence or hand-to-mouth farming. So once the land is cleared, farming will take place. However, without its normal source of nutrients, which would be the rotting plant and animal matter, the soil soon becomes infertile, and the farmers are forced to move on to a new location. Shifting cultivation is very common amongst indigenous groups in rainforests. Shifting cultivation is often criticized for causing problems such as the killing or disturbance of flora and fauna, which are plants and animals. Also, the breaking of the nitrogen cycle, causing soil to lose its fertility very quickly. Breaking the stability of the oil and causing topsoil erosion. Tree roots are very good at holding soil in place. If you remove these roots, which you would do when clearing the land, then water and wind erosion is just more likely to happen. Also, more flash floods are caused by the reduced interception, so faster saturation of ground and increased surface runoff. Also, the silting of rivers caused by topsoil being washed into rivers. The silt can then be washed into the seas, blocking shipping channels or damaging reefs. However, others would argue that shifting cultivation is normally carried out by indigenous groups who have been custodians of the rainforest for thousands of years, and therefore should know how to take care for it. Also, it maintains a traditional way of life, and is only small scale, as opposed to some of large cattle ranchers that deforest large areas of rainforest. So, some more definitions. Slash and burn farming. This is the process of cutting down areas of forest, so you cut down a lot of trees. Then you burn the stubble or the roots in order to farm. Because land will become infertile very quickly, slash and burn farmers will move land every few years, so it's pretty much shifting cultivation. Nomadic simply means moving from one place to another place. Subsistence farmers who practice shifting cultivation, so slash and burn farming, are nomadic because they move locations every few years. So, organic crops and farming. This is farming that uses natural varieties and natural farming techniques. There is only very limited use of fertilizers. It is good because crops take longer to ripen, so they'll have a better flavor. Also, limited fertilizers or pesticides are used, so there is minimal runoff into rivers or infiltration into groundwater stores. There are also much less chemicals that may be consumed by customers. Also, organic crops often get a higher price when sold to consumers. There are also some problems with organic crops and farming methods. Well, the crops would not be uniform. They don't all look the same. Although this is natural, it may put off some customers because they'll be like, "That'd be disgusting." The crops may be susceptible to diseases, and they may take longer to grow, increasing the growing season. And the crops may need more water to grow, considering that they don't use all the chemicals to make up for that. Okay, then you've got genetically modified farming and crops. So, genetically modified crops are crops that have their genes altered by, scientists to improve quality and or quantity. So what are some advantages? Firstly, the crops will all be the same in shape, which makes storage and transport easier and will also look nice for customers. If they're all the same size and all the same shape, it's very nice when you're at the supermarket. So the growing season is often shorter and can often be possible to have 2 or more crop seasons per year, because GM farming goes very quick. Then crops may be drought resistant, so less water is used in their production, because, they can't die of droughts. And it's also perhaps possible for GM crops in areas that we previously said were unsuitable to farm. For instance, if there's bad land or something, you could still potentially grow GM crops because they're like so modified genetically that they can survive in places that normal plants couldn't. What are some disadvantages of using these genetically modified crops? Well, you would have a native natural species that would die perhaps as a result because they can't compete with the genetically modified crops. And the taste is often not as good because they have been grown quicker and often grown for appearance rather than taste. And it can also lead to the development of superweeds to compete with the stronger GM crops. So weeds that eventually over time evolve to be really resistant to all the pesticides and all that jazz. Also, no one really knows the long-term effects on humans for genetically modified farming. We don't really know if there's kind of diseases or anything like that. Okay, apart from organic farming, it is possible for farmers to be more environmentally sustainable by following a number of other practices, including A. Planting hedges to act as windbreaks and create habitats for animals. So if you plant a hedge in front of your crop and then there's a lot of wind that would have usually blown over your crops and destroyed it, well, if there's a hedge, it can't, so that's a good thing. Also, you can protect plants and animal species by building or protecting habitats, like leaving areas of woodland, meadow, and lakes there so that, either no other animals come to eat them or something, or wind or something like that. So, you can protect a little habitat for them. Also, you can put aside part of their land to grow wild natural species. That's good. And you can also rotate crops and grow a greater variety of traditional native crops. You can also allow animals to graze, so to eat outdoors rather than live in cages. So free-range animals and eggs. You can also use traditional farming methods instead of relying on fertilizers and pesticides, like natural manure, so their excretion, so their feces, you can use those to fertilize. Also, you can introduce more fallow periods to allow soil to rest. The fallow is when you don't farm on it, you kind of let the soil rest, and this is good because otherwise the soil may be over-cultivated when you use it too much. Also, you can open educational centers like city farms to encourage others to be more environmentally sustainable. Okay, some case studies. Firstly, what are some, if it asks you, give us like the land uses of a farm in a named area. You will say Canada for the country, and then you will say in the Canadian prairies, which will be your place-specific reference, wheat farming, because they have really deep and fertile soils called Chernozem soils. You don't need to know it, but you kind of should. You never know. It could always get you an extra mark. So wheat farming because of deep, fertile Chernozem soils, because it asks you what's like the point of having this land in this area? Why do we use that land? Well, firstly, it's got deep, fertile Chernozem soils, and it also has a large expanse of land to grow wide variety in areas like wheat notes, because it's very large land and it's flat. You can easily grow a lot of different kind of things. Also, since it's such a flat land and it's pretty large, you can use machinery for harvesting, which makes it so much quicker. Also, in Canada, as we all know, sometimes the below 0 degrees Celsius temperatures in winter break up soil to allow ease of plowing. Yeah, that's good. And also, there is a good railway link to Great Lakes, allowing export of cereal crops. That is also a place-specific reference to Great Lakes. So they do have a good railway link to this place, to the Great Lakes, which will allow them to export, so to transport their crops. Okay. Then if it asks you for an example of a small-scale So not a large thing, it's not commercial, it's just very small, subsistence, so hand to mouth, you're making it just for yourself, farming. You will say Bangladesh, the Ganges Valley. So, firstly, they plant rice in their nursery, so they kind of prepare it first. Then, once it's kind of ready, they transplant it to the paddy field, which is what we call the place where, they're gonna have the crops. Then you plow using a plow. No, plowing using plow drawn by a water buffalo. So a water buffalo, that animal is carrying this kind of plow, I don't even know how to pronounce that, and he just prepares the field. And then, once it's eventually grown, you harvest the rice using a sickle. That kind of thingy that the Grim Reaper has, that kind of weird shaped thing. Then, it's watered using traditional irrigation channels, and the monsoon climate also helps. So, if it asks for an example of a large-scale commercial farming, you'll go back to Canada to the Canadian prairies. So what they do, it's large-scale cereal growing. The inputs would be deep fertile soils, machinery, fertilizer, labor, capital, climate, flat lands for usage of large machines, etc. Then processes would be planting, harvesting, using combined harvester, and taking grain to ports by rails. Then outputs would be the cereal crops for bread making, wheat, and profit. Okay. Famine. Famine is when the demand for food exceeds the supply for food, leading to undernourishment. Prolonged undernourishment can damage people's health and eventually lead to starvation. Drought. This is when the demand for water exceeds the supply of water, causing water stress, so water shortages. Soil degradation. This is a reduction in the quality of the soil, making it harder to grow things, because it's degrading the quality. Desertification. This is when the soil becomes degraded and turns into a desert because it's that dry and nutrientless. Soil erosion is the removal of topsoil, so it's normally the most fertile layer of the topsoil. And it's usually done by wind or water because it blows it away or kind of pulls it into the river. Soil is much more vulnerable to erosion when no vegetation is growing on it. For instance, look at dunes. Okay. Human causes of famine. Firstly, overpopulation. The growing population of the world means that the demand for food is increasing. Unfortunately, the supply of food is not always matching this demand. This is a problem that Malthus, the guy who had this theory about, population, he did predict this problem. And, because when there are too many people, there's not enough food. Also, overgrazing. This is when people try to graze, so have their animals eat too much grass on land. Then all the vegetation can be eaten. This reduces the integrity of the soil and can cause topsoil, so the most fertile layer, to erode and therefore soil degradation and who knows, maybe eventually desertification. So overgrazing is definitely a problem. Overcultivation is also a problem because if you try to grow much on land, you can cause its degradation by using all the nutrients and not giving them time to recover. This is why you should usually give them fallow time. If the land becomes degraded, then obviously the yields will decline because the land has degraded in quality. Deforestation. By deforesting large areas of woodland, you ruin again the integrity of the soil because you take away its source of nutrients. This can cause soil degradation and erosion, both leading to reduced yields. Pollution. Farming and industrial pollution can both degrade the land and reduce yields of crops. Conflict. When fighting takes place, it is often men that fight, removing them from farming duties, and therefore reducing yield. Also, conflict can make land dangerous to farm mines or degrade the soil because of chemical or biological warfare. So that's never good. So then corruption. Sometimes government officials or armies can use crops for themselves or their own needs, leading to the general population going hungry. So what are some physical causes of famine? Firstly, temperature. Temperatures that are too hot or too cold can both kill crops and animals. And most crops do need steady and reliable temperatures. So if they kill the crops, then everyone goes hungry. Also, rainfall. If there's a shortage of rainfall, then most crops will die or need extra irrigation. If water to irrigate is not available, then crops will begin to die and yields will reduce. Flooding. Although all crops need rainfall, especially things like rice, too much rainfall can flood and kill crops or wash away topsoil, reducing the soil's fertility. Natural disasters. Natural disasters like hurricanes, tsunamis, and volcanoes can destroy large areas of agricultural land. They can also kill and injure farmers. Both factors reduce yields. So, soil fertility. If soil is infertile because the bedrock contains few minerals or there is no flora and fauna, so plants and animals, to provide a humus layer, then it can be hard to cultivate the land and lead to low yields. So what are some general problems caused by drought and famine? Well, you've got livestock death. When there is a shortage of water and food, animals are the first to go without, so animals will start to die. This makes famine even worse because there is less meat, eggs, milk, etc. Also, crop failure. Drought can cause crops to fail, but also, when there is famine, people often become too weak to work anyway, so less crops are grown and the famine worsens. Illness. When there is a shortage of food and water, people become weak from undernourishment, which is the lack of food, and are more vulnerable to getting sick. Also, death. Severe drought and famine will eventually lead to death. It is usually the very old, young, or already sick that die first. Conflict. If the resources of food and water are declining, fighting over these resources is likely to increase. So more conflict, especially between different tribes and countries. Loss of education. When drought happens, people have to travel further to find food and water. They also become sicker. Both of these factors can impact students and teachers. What it affects is that it means that people are either unable to go to school or they have no one to teach them once they are at school. Loss of income. If people are unable to work, they are unable to earn money. Also, many countries that suffer from famine have large primary sectors, so exploiting raw materials. Famine normally means that the primary sector, so farming, has collapsed and people have nothing to sell to make money. What are some solutions to famine and land degradation? So, crop rotation and fallow periods. By using different crops and allowing the land to rest, it gives nutrients and minerals the chance to return to soil, making it more fertile and hopefully increase yields over longer periods. Desalination. Taking water from the sea and removing the salt to make it good for drinking and agricultural uses is good, because if more water is available, then it's possible to water arid, so dry areas of land and hopefully increase crop production. Irrigation. This means watering the land. By irrigating more dry, so arid areas, we should be able to increase agricultural output. Reforestation and afforestation. By foresting areas of land, it can ensure that the nitrogen cycle, so the nutrients, is maintained. It can increase the stability and integrity of the soil, and it can also form a windbreak from erosion, and finally prevent flash floods. All these factors should improve the quality of the soil and hopefully crop yields. Fertilizers and pesticides. Although an overuse of fertilizers and pesticides can damage the soil and pollute nearby water courses, if they are used properly, they should improve the amount of nutrients present in the soil. Genetically modified crops. Some people believe that GM crops could drastically reduce famine by increasing yields, by allowing crops to grow more quickly, grow bigger, and be more drought and disease resistant. And improved distribution of crops. It is argued that there is currently enough food to feed everyone, but it is not distributed evenly. Governments, charities, and organizations like the World Food Program can try and distribute food more evenly so no one goes hungry. Population policies. By reducing population growth, especially in areas with low agricultural outputs, we should be able to reduce shortages of food and therefore famine. So this is where you can implement anti-natalist policies. So another case study. Explain why there is a shortage of food somewhere. So in Ethiopia, there can be a drought. There was a drought which extended into the neighboring Eritrea, which is a different country, but it is a place-specific reference, so do use it. So a drought which extended into the neighboring Eritrea reduces yield of crops. Overcultivation, as fields are not given fallow time, so they don't get a break. Overgrazing due to keeping too many cattle, especially in the northern region of Tigray. Lack of investment in irrigation or fertilizers, and they're still using traditional farming practices such as plowing up and down slopes, which we all know is not very efficient. And also, poverty prevents them from buying the fertilizers and pesticides.